Hey guys, this is the revised version of the 6.5 video. I'm basically going to keep the video as is, but I'm going to add a few words of caution at the beginning here. So if you're not sure and if you're new to VESC, just stick to whatever firmware came on your controller. Now, if you're an experienced user, Benjamin Vetter was basically telling me that upgrading firmware to 6.5 without rerunning the motor wizard or doing manual motor calibration is a bad idea. This kind of goes against everything we've been doing for the last 2, 3, 4 years, but apparently enough has changed in 6.5 that the method that I've been following isn't safe. Now, having said that, the changes aren't as big as he makes it sound. Just a few of the motor detection values get slightly different. But the key thing to remember that I want everyone to know is if you're using 6.5, the one setting that you definitely have to change is you go into FOC Advanced and you change the speed tracker to corrected position. This is the new default, so if you're loading new 6.5 firmware and you're running the wizard, you get that setting no matter what. But if you're restoring a 6.2 configuration, you end up with the wrong settings, which is observer, and that one apparently causes problems in 6.5. I still don't understand what exactly changed for that to be a problem, because that setting used to work perfectly fine all the way till now. But whatever it is, something changed the way speed is being tracked, and if you don't do this, it's actually really dangerous, because what can happen is your ERPMs stay artificially low, so by a factor of 50 or so, meaning that the board will think and the balance algorithm will think that you're less than a mile an hour slow, meaning that the heel lift remains active all the way up to like 15-20 miles an hour, which is really dangerous for one-wheelers. So very important to make at least that change. Even better, rerun the motor wizard or manual motor calibration, but that's essentially the key for making 6.5 safe. And there's really nothing indicating so far that 6.5 is not safe. It's perfectly fine firmware, but that issue has caused several people to nosedive, and so that's why it's important to make this change. The other issue is a bug introduced by Spintend. They basically created their momentary switch support in a very hacky manner. They just copy pasted some code from the VESC code base straight into their hardware specific files, and so they weren't following the normal interfaces. So when they made changes to that behavior in 6.5, it basically created a trap for Spintend users and causing also basically shutdowns. So you would have, let's say, a shutdown timeout set to 10 minutes, and that timeout would be triggered even if you're riding. So your board would just shut down after that configured timeout time. And yeah, there is a fix out there for it. So please look for that. Do not ride stock Spintend firmware with 6.5 if you're using a momentary switch. Now, the third issue with 6.05 is in the app itself, and that's going to be fixed soon, but right now it is still possible that with the app, if you're connecting to, let's say, the float package or refloat package, that it sometimes doesn't read your settings, meaning it keeps it all default. So if you go in, make a quick change and hit save, it could set basically just your new change, but everything else will be defaults. So just the other day at a group ride, I quickly wanted to set disable moving faults. So I went in there, made that change, hit right, and bam, I got all defaults. And luckily I immediately noticed the high voltage tilt back kicking in way too early, so I didn't even go more than 5 feet. I connected float control, and sure enough, it warned me about all these issues. And luckily I had a backup on my VESC app on the phone. But that's basically what you want to do, is until the fix is out, there will be a fix released very soon, but until that happens, make sure that you always verify that the reading was successful. So check some of your values, check your high voltage tilt back or whatever, to see that it has been set to your value before proceeding to make any change and then hitting the right button. So those are all the issues. Now let's continue with the original video. Hey guys, today another video about firmware. I really didn't want to be talking about firmware anymore, but 6.5 just came out, and unfortunately all of the apps updated thanks to Apple and Google. So now a lot of people are confused about whether they need to update or not. So I want to just talk about what it is, should you do it, and how do you do it. So let's start with what it is. The software that we need to run the VESC consists of multiple layers. So one is the app. It's called the VESC tool, or there's other apps too, but that's considered the app or the tool. Then when we say firmware, firmware is essentially the underlying motor control software, and it's kind of like an operating system for your controller. So that gets loaded on the controller. And that firmware has just been replaced. So the original was 6.02, also called 6.2, and now the new one is 6.5 or 6.05. And basically that's what's running on the controller. And then on top of that, you got the package. Package is essentially also a firmware code, but it is loaded after the main firmware. The package is what contains all of the balance code and the balance logic. ATR and all of that stuff is all in the float package or refloat package. But right now I'm talking about firmware. And the firmware, that's the part that you normally don't replace very often. We had 6.02 for well over a year, but now 6.05 is out, and unfortunately the app keeps popping up a message saying that, oh, you're running old firmware. So it feels like it's compelling you to update. So that's what it is. By the way, got this hat from Mike from Reno Propulsion Labs. I was kind of just joking when somebody was asking for a 113 hat. I was asking, hey, if anyone can see a 126 hat, I'll take it. Mike went ahead and had a few made and sent me one, so thanks for that. There's really no urgent reason for anybody to update. Everything is fine with 6.2, and when I say 6.2, I mean 6.02, because to me that's interchangeable. So 6.5, 6.05, same thing. But because most apps have updated automatically to 6.5, we now are in a situation where the app starts and it warns you that your firmware is old or whatever. There is no checkbox currently to disable that warning, so it pops up every time. And also there apparently has been a bug, especially if you have CAN devices. So if you have an X-Lite or a VESC Express connected, like with a Thor or an X12, there is apparently a bug that can fail to read your settings. And then what happens is you hit right and everything basically gets set to 0, or the defaults. And yeah, so people have been reporting all their settings being lost. That's perfectly avoidable. If you want to stay on 6.2, just make sure that you actually read your settings first and then make a change and write, then everything works just fine. But yeah, so that's currently a bug, and apparently they're working on it, and it's supposed to get fixed in 6.05. So there's going to be an update even in the Apple App Store, but it's not out yet as of early September. So maybe end of September or so of 2024 is when it should be done. But now 6.05, should you update, and what's the key new features? So first of all, the app is a lot better now, because if you have a CAN-based connection like Thor or X12, everything pops up really quickly. And I think even for the non-CAN devices, the package settings, they get remembered. So you actually see your package related settings in the package tab shows up right away, as opposed to making you wait 10 to 20 seconds, what sometimes feels like forever, until it shows up. So that's a huge usability improvement. But there's other features too. There is the brake current, for example. So now the board no longer rolls away. Here, let me show you. One thing that was never really that great with VESC boards is the braking behavior when you step off the board. And I'm not talking about braking when you're riding. That was always fine and superior to future motion behavior. But now let's take a look at this. Oh shit. Yeah. So basically you can see the board is not moving, and any other VESC board on 6.2 would be rolling away. There is a new setting here. Let me show you that. In VESC tool, it is motor config FOC advanced at the very bottom. You get here, short low side FETs on zero duty. That needs to be checked. That needs to be enabled. And then you get this behavior. So that's one thing. The other thing is some of the sensorless transition behavior has been improved. They're now, instead of there being a fixed ERPM at which the transition takes place, usually between 1500 and 2000 is what we typically use. Now there's a range. So in between the start and end ERPM, which I would say you should set to about 1000 to 2000, in between it sort of overlays the two algorithms and does a more smooth transition, as opposed to a hard transition where at 1990 it's running on Hall sensors, and at 2005 it's running on back EMF. So that should help with some difficult crunch cases where you get the sensorless transition crunch on some motors. And then what else? There is now also the ability, especially for X12 users, there is a new option in the motor config. If you hit ... you see this measure FOC offsets. I'm not currently connected. I'm still connected on my app, but that's a feature that was missing, and it's actually crucial for X12s and maybe some other controllers as well, so that you can measure your FOC offsets on demand rather than doing it automatically on boot. Then what else? Oh yeah, so stuff like this. Let's see if you can hear it. So you basically get the ability to make the motor play sounds like here. Well, silly stuff like that, but can also be used for haptic buzz. Here, if I do lower frequencies. Oh That was loud. Okay. Yeah, so that is a feature only available in 6.5. I don't know, there might be other stuff, but those are the most important things for us. Especially the brake is really cool. It's always been embarrassing how our boards used to just roll down any mild hill, whereas future motion boards would just stay in place. So we basically match that behavior now. Yeah, so how do you update? And I don't want to give a full tutorial on updating. I don't want to actually update my board right now. But here are the key things that you need to remember. So, first of all, when you're in the VESC tool, when you update firmware, and I know that this affects brand new users too, because you just received your new controller. Let's say you got a Thor, and it's your first VESC, or you got the GTV kit from Floatwheel, and now the app is 6.5, the firmware that you received is 6.2, and the first thing you see is this warning that you got old firmware. So now we got brand new users updating firmware. And here is the key thing to remember. All your settings, a lot of the VESCs now ship pre-configured. Tony's stuff ships pre-configured, and the Thor from Fungineers also comes pre-configured. When you load firmware, all that gets erased. So there's an easy way around that, and that is you hit this backup button here. You see backup configs right there. That doesn't work for me now, obviously, because I'm not connected. But this big button here, that lets you back up your config. One thing to keep in mind with the backup is you need to wait for app UI to show up. Okay, fine, I'm gonna show you. Let me disconnect here. And I will now connect. So, by the way, you see how quickly this app UI just showed up? This used to never be the case. But if you're still on an older firmware, it'll take longer. You gotta wait until that shows up. Then you can press the backup config button, and that saves your motor config, your app config, and your package config to the app, to your phone. And it saves it in a hidden location. Don't ask where the files are. There is no files. You can't access them. If you want files, there is the option to do it manually. You can go into like motor config ... and say save XML. Then you get an actual file. If you use backup, you don't have a file, but you don't need a file unless you're migrating phones or something. So backup configs. And then you load firmware. You also lose your package when you load firmware. How do we update firmware? So firmware can be found. There's no longer a tab up top, but now there is this button here, update firmware, right there. So here, if you're lucky, then you have a controller that had a correctly named firmware, and you can just use the included files, and then just like mine here, it'll already show up, and you can just say upload, and off you go. But if you got a Thor, for example, then Fungineers made it a bit more tricky for you, because he gave you a firmware file that he named with some V04 at the end of the hardware name, which means that the VESC tool looks at that name and says, whoop, I don't know what that is, so I have nothing for you, which means you got to go to custom. And in order to go to custom, you need a file, and that file you can find on the firmware archive. Let me find that for you. Firmware archive. So if you just Google VESC firmware archive and click on the first hit, it takes you to this page here. Then you go to, where are we now? Code 6.05. you go to whatever, here, let's go Thor. So you download Thor 300 and VESC default. They are all called VESC default.bin, so make sure you select the right file. Right now here I see Thor 300, VESC default.bin. If you have multiple different controllers, I suggest you rename those bin files so that you don't load the wrong one, because that can brick your controller. So you save that file, just save it to files, and now you can pick that file in update. And you should be good to go. But yeah, so VESC has no way to tell whether you loaded the correct file. It will reject any file that doesn't end in .bin. But other than that, it is pretty generous in letting you pick bad files. So just be careful, make sure you download the correct one. If you're not 100% sure, ask somebody else, and then go with that. In a few cases, the controller will not have a perfectly working bootloader or bootloader that's compatible with 6.x firmware. So in that case, you go to the bootloader tab, you just keep the generic one here, and you hit upload. That's quick and easy, not a big deal. I've never heard anybody have issues with bootloaders. Not much you can screw up there. And once the bootloader is loaded, then you go to the firmware. But if you've done that already in the past year or so, then you don't need a bootloader again. The key sign that you need a bootloader is you loaded firmware, and then down here at the bottom where it says firmware v6.05 for me, if it doesn't show that you got the new version that you just loaded, then you probably need a bootloader, because there will be no error. If you don't have the bootloader, the whole upload process will still look like it works, everything will look fine, and then you reconnect and everything looks great, except you look down here at the bottom. If it doesn't show the version number that you were looking for, then you know that it was the bootloader. After loading firmware, the next thing you do is you go to package store, you hit update archive, and then you install the package that you want to use, either float or refloat. I would highly recommend refloat, but if you're a brand new user, you're better off with float, because the config that you just saved, let's say your LEDs, they will not work out of the box with refloat. It's not hard to make it work with refloat, but just keep in mind, with float, it will just work. You just restore the config, and then you get Fungineers' default setup. Stick to float if you're totally new. If you have a little bit of experience, you're upgrading, I would encourage you to go to refloat, and then that's a whole different topic. So let's stick to firmware here. Once you've updated and once you've loaded the package again that you were using, then you hit restore configs, and everything should be restored and back to the way it was. And ideally, you don't need to make any changes in the 6.5 configuration. Everything will just work out of the box. But since we do have the new version, let's make sure that we're actually enabling and configuring the new features. So let's start with motor config FOC advanced. You want to make sure that you turn this on. Also, speed tracker position. That one defaults to observer, but actually corrected position is better. It prevents your ERPMs from being noisy at 0, at standstill, which means that your brake won't be constantly engaging and wasting energy and draining your battery. Oh yeah, if we go to Hall sensors, you can now see ERPM start and end. So the first two fields here. Make sure that they're not like super close together. But actually, I can't really say if them being super close together causes an issue. So play around with it. Just be aware that there is this gradual transition now. And I think that's all I got. So that is it. Good luck.